Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. We're just going to wait a few minutes to let people register and come in. While you're waiting, we'd love to know who you are. So you should see a poll in front of you. While you're waiting, do let us know if you're a teacher, student, parent, or anything else. And also, please feel free to use the chat and say hello. We'd love to know where you're dialing in from. So do drop us some hellos. Tell us your names.
And what the weather's like.
How your week's been so far. Is anyone isolating, homeschooling, online teaching? I think there's going to be quite a few people doing that at the moment.
We've had people from all over the world, so it'd be interesting to see what to know what country people are from.
Hi, Melinda. So mainly teachers with us so far. I'll make a start while you're doing that poll. So welcome to the Pearson Maths Festival. We are really pleased to have you join us. My name is Preeti Carter. I'm one of the Maths product managers at Pearson. Also joining me, who you can see there, are Mark Heslop and Pietro Tozzi, who will introduce themselves in just a minute. We believe that maths should be engaging and accessible to all our learners and all our teachers teaching. Our aim over the course of the festival has been to come together as the maths teaching community to share ideas and stories of how to engage and inspire our learners, especially in how we can amplify the teaching and learning experience and empower all those involved in maths education, teachers, learners, families, and communities. That's why our free conference has been focused on driving that conversation, from reflecting on the recent changes in education and sharing best practice to what the future of maths education could look like. Together with you, fellow educators and industry experts, our conversation will drive how we can help schools, colleges, learners and families make the most of maths education now and in the future. To ensure as many people as possible can benefit from our discussions, we'll be recording this session as we have done so with the others over the last week. During the session, all participants can send in questions via the Q&A box. If you want to ask myself, Pietro or Mark a specific question, do drop it in the Q&A. If we can't answer your question during the session, we'll follow it up after the event. Please also, as I said, use the chat function. We'd love for you to sort of talk to each other and chat amongst yourselves and us as well. If you are putting a message in the chat, if you can make sure you've clicked on all panelists and attendees so that everybody could see your message when it goes out, otherwise it will just come to the host. You can also be part of the conversation on social media too, using the hashtag Pearson Maths Fest 21, and by entering our mini competitions, nominating your colleagues as maths champions, and answering our polls that you'll see on the Pearson Schools Twitter pages. So do get involved. I have been really excited about putting together this session to present today. I've been involved in many aspects of the qualification product lifecycle during my time working for Pearson, and I led on the development for the current A-level maths qualifications. There's so much that goes on behind the scenes when we develop assessments. There are so many amazing people who work hard to bring it all together. In this session, we'll be lifting the lid on assessments, focusing on the A-level maths journey and analysing some of the complexities of the qualification and looking at the impact it's had on students and teachers. I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Heslop and Pietro Tozzi this afternoon. Do you want to introduce yourself first, Mark?
Yep. So hi, my name is Mark Heslop. I'm the A-level maths subject partner. So it's me, and I have a GCSE maths subject partner that works alongside me as well, Nicola Woodford-Smith. So you'll see us both on Twitter. I joined Pearson just after Christmas, after 15 years in the classroom. I was 6 years as a head of department, and I was on the A-level content advisory board that put together and adjusted the specification back in 2014.
And
And
Pietro?
yes,
Sorry,
hi.
go ahead.
No, sorry, I hope you can all hear me. Yeah, so I just got quite a lot of teaching experience. I started teaching back in 1985, and my contribution for this A level was I wrote the schemes of work for the A level pure and the mechanics, AS and A level, and a bit of the further maths. And I've been supporting schools as a credible specialist for Pearson since 2008. So I go back a long way, but there we are. I'm still here and still enthusiastic. So I'll hand back to Preeti. Thank you.
Thanks, Pietro. And yes, if you follow the Maths Emporium and regularly attend our networks, you'll know Mark and Pietro quite well. They are experienced teachers, as they say, but also in their current roles, they work closely with maths teachers and support and develop. So they help us to gain that really deep insight into what your needs are. We will also be hearing from Franklin Heisnelli later, a former student who sat his A-level maths exams in June 2019. So the introduction of the new reformed linear A-level maths qualification created opportunities for better mathematical understanding, but also a great deal of uncertainty for both teachers and students who for more than 20 years had taught and studied the qualification under the more flexible modular approach. So planning for the qualification started in 2014 with some initial research that was carried out by the ALCAB panel that Mark just mentioned. ALCAB are the A-level Content Advisory Board, and they were a group that was formed to carry out initial research to inform the new DFE content for both maths and further. So Mark, on that panel, what were the key results from that group and the thinking behind them?
It was an interesting time. So most people don't realize that content is actually for the main qualifications is actually written and specified by Department for Education. Assessment, the criteria for assessment are actually specified by Ofqual. So what happened in 2014 was the Department for Education decided that they wanted to review the A-level mathematics content. So they formed the ALCAB panel, a panel of effectively experts to just review what was going on in the country, suggest some reforms. That went to DFE for basically consultation, and then over to Ofqual to effectively do consultation on the assessment criteria. And the interesting bit is some of the things that came out of it. For instance, there was never a DFE specification before for further mathematics. So the exam boards could actually apply to have their qualifications certified by DFE and Ofqual. And nominally they were the same, but there was some actual huge differences in between them. So I think there was only 2 out of the 4 main specifications that actually had second-order differential equations, for instance. There was never a specification before for the applied side, and the universities that were represented suddenly came back with, that's why it's like they've all studied different stuff when they come to us with nominally the same qualification. So I think there was one of the 4 main specifications that didn't actually include any distributions on statistics or statistics 1 module. So what we decided to do was actually standardize on it. So when you've got students perhaps moving between schools, teachers moving between schools, it makes it easier to support the learners if they've all studied the same things, and easier for universities to support students when they come to them if they've all studied the same thing. So we effectively standardized the applied content to be mechanics and statistics and tweaked the pure content. So there is, wording in the specification now on effectively proof. Now, proof was always assessed in the specification, but it was never formally there actually in the wording. So it's not a new thing that was brought in. It's more of a slight change in emphasis. The other things that changed effectively was the introduction of a large data set, calculators where students should be able to calculate normal and binomial distributions. It did feel like we were living in the dark ages. It's the equivalent of looking up values in trig tables or log tables. So it's felt that students should be able to use those functions on the calculators. And on the further math side, what we effectively did was set a common pure content specification for the pure side of further maths, but then leave it to the examination boards to develop and innovate. It felt important to leave the examination boards some room to be innovative and surprise people, bring new things to the spec on the applied side.
Yeah, and the idea was to create a qualification that supports students following a broad range of further education options, wasn't it? So they could
That's
have
that's part of the problem of you could tune A-level maths just to support effectively maths degrees, but actually maths degrees aren't the largest consumer of A-level mathematics in terms of technical content. That's probably more likely to be engineering. So one of the issues is that A-level maths has to support such a broad range of degree courses. We could specialize and make it better in one area at the expense of another. So the idea was to keep it as a broad range of skills that then universities and employers and other educational providers can then build on. But it felt important that they knew what they were starting with.
Yeah, and as you alluded to, Mark, in addition to this, the inclusion of the new Ofqual assessment requirements relating to problem solving, modelling, mathematical communication, and the large data set also introduce a layer of some quite difficult concepts which were the key drivers that influence the design of the qualifications. And that's them that I've just dropped in there. So much greater level of detail applied to the assessment objectives with a greater emphasis on problem solving and modelling. And then entwined within the assessment objectives, which not everybody again is aware of unless you studied them in detail, is this requirement to make sure we allow students opportunities to answer questions that allow extended responses and demonstrate how they connect together the different areas of the content as well. So that was quite a big new thing. And the purpose and the main emphasis of the content and assessment objectives put together was this requirement for coherence and connection within mathematics. So all quite new stuff coming through there that wasn't previously sort of studied or taught before. So this new territory, so Mark and Pietro, you were both teachers when the spec came out in 2017. It was new to most teachers, wasn't it? Because we were emerging from this very long period of a modularized curriculum, and it's all most of us have ever known. What was the reaction to the new content and the specification?
I think people were surprised. We'd been in the previous specification, and there were slight tweaks in, I think, 2004, 2005. Further maths was tweaked in about 2009, 2010. But it's absolutely unprecedented in terms of a qualification for it to last, somewhere in between 50 and you could argue 20 years, and it's pretty much its current content form. So, it did come as a shock to the system. And I think the biggest step up in difficulty for people and students certainly was that stepping up to linear qualification, where the AS level's decoupled. They can still set the AS level. It counts for 40% of the points of university points, but it doesn't count towards their A level. And I think that was one of the most challenging things for learners to wrap their heads around. I think if we would have actually taken this content apart with these assessment criteria and put it back in modular form, but with this, a greater emphasis on problem solving, extended responses, I think students would have found that a lot easier. And it was that shock to students and to teachers about just how difficult students find a linear qualification of this level.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. I mean, you sometimes have to think outside the box and do like a holistic approach to teaching topics. And I can remember when I taught it, I taught the mechanics for it, and it was when we did upper six mechanics, I was having to drop in AS starters and build on the things, and the difficulty was keeping the old skills ticking over at the same time as teaching the new skills. You can't bank it anymore, and I think that's the biggest difference, really. Yeah,
I don't think there's anything per se wrong with that. It's just from our point of view as an examination board, how do we make sure that students have a positive experience of their exams? I did hear someone say once that exams shouldn't be pleasant for students. I'm not sure I entirely agree with that, but they shouldn't be traumatic. And it's about how we move things forward to make sure that everyone comes out of it, regardless of what grade they're getting, feeling like they've actually done themselves justice and feeling like, they can hold their heads high.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing, and it will be coming up a little bit later on, is that a lot of schools that I've been supporting over the years, they got into a habit of doing S1, D1 as the options and not doing mechanics. And all of a sudden, the D1's gone into further maths. and they're having to do mechanics and stats and their staffing and
the decision maths was an interesting one from the LCAP panel, because a lot of the universities says, especially the computer science courses, maths operational research, and they said we really value D1, it needs to stay in. And then we showed them what was actually in the different boards D1 specs, and they said, actually no, this is so out of date. We'd rather just teach this ourselves. We'd rather than come in with problem-solving skills and ability to model problems, and that's why decision maths was moved into further maths for redevelopment. But yeah, that has caused problems. So a lot of teachers do have it. They find mechanics challenging. But, it'd be interesting to hear in the chat about which side of the fence that we people fall on, and Preeti is going to fire up a poll in a little while. But yes, about your thoughts about why particularly people have mental blocks on, say, the statistics side or the pure side, because you could argue that the maths inside the mechanics or the statistics is more straightforward than what we're asking teachers to teach in the pure side.
I think a lot of it's historical on what the teacher learned when they're a student, and that kind of stays with them.
Yep. I mean, I'm an engineer by training and by profession. I spent 10 years in engineering, and it's quite interesting that when I actually moved into industry, the one element that was really felt was lacking from my degree was actually a good knowledge of statistics. When you're looking at capability studies of production lines, can it produce something in components without wastage? Well, actually, I really needed to gen up on my statistics. So I kind of flipped slightly from being a pure mechanics person into being enjoying the statistics side.
I was the opposite, because I just did pure and stats on my A levels, and then I hit university, and it's like,
see how much variation there is just with 3 people on the panel.
Yeah. we do actually have a poll on this, actually, Jerry. Can you fire it out for us, please? So, which subject area are you most confident teaching? We'd love to know.
Oh, let's say confident with all. Oh, it's moving around quite a bit.
It'll settle.
That's interesting. I'm just going to quickly share that with everyone. There you go. So pure, obviously, but I think stats and mechanics are quite level there.
I think it is worth flagging up to people that we do sessions on mechanics and statistics each year. There are recordings online, that you can access of these sessions, and we're about to put a survey out about training for the next year about what you want to see, and if there's anything you want us to flag up on that one, then by all means flag up what you want more of.
Yeah. So for as an example, the development of the qualification posed many opportunities and challenges because of this criteria. We worked with senior examiners and key stakeholders to ensure that we were meeting and learning the aims of the subject criteria set out by the DFE and Ofqual, while striving to ensure that the qualification was accessible to a wide range of abilities and that teachers were able to deliver it. We wanted to try to maintain the spirit of the legacy qualification to make that transition easier, but it was quite a challenge given the characteristics of a linear qualification model and the demands of the new criteria. And the idea of the new spec, as I've sort of alluded to already, was to produce more free-thinking individuals and for them to have the ability to think mathematically. But we found the ability to test that thinking mathematically quite challenging. It's one thing to teach it and do it, but to test it was quite a challenge. And you would obviously know, if you having taught the legacy spec and the new spec, that, for instance, previously in the content that was previously in C1 to C4, now in a single question, how that might impact the demand of that question. But what we also had to deal with was the added complexity of making sure we hit all those assessment objective weightings, targets, and within each of the AOs, if you've seen the detailed assessment objectives, the requirement at strand level too. And if I just showed an example, I'm trying to get rid of this poll, there we go. So in the legacy qualification, we're looking at AO3 and AO4 there, which in the legacy tested the modelling and the problem-solving elements of the qualification, and in total that needed to cover 15% of the qualification overall. Those assessment objectives in a new qualification, AO3 and modelling and problem solving, are now entwined in AO3 together, and also have to test 25% of the qualification. So that's a big step up. And then within that, we need to make sure we hit certain percentages in how they are grouped. So strands 1 and 2 have to cover 40% of the qualification together, and we have to make sure that there are some questions where 3, 4, and 5 are entwined, and things like that. So that's just one example which may of how it made sort of balancing everything quite difficult for the examiners when they're writing the papers. The detailed AO guidance is in the back of the specification if you want to look at it to see what I mean. Do have a look at it if you haven't already. Following Ofqual accreditation for the qualification, we produced the Writer Guide, which is an internal handbook of how to construct A-level maths and further maths papers. And it is now used by our senior examiners to ensure that we are meeting the criteria for each paper. And of course, most importantly, to ensure that there's that consistency across each of the exam series, so that we set fair assessments that are appropriately testing the mathematical ability of all students, across the whole paper. And we actually do this for all subjects across general qualifications, across the Pearson general qualifications. It's a requirement that we set out. So June 2019 was the first full cohort of students sitting their A-level maths exams. Pearson had over 68,000 entries for the qualification. And as you will know, many students found the exams to be more difficult than they were expecting. Those of you tuned in who are teachers, if you're able to write in the chat, it'd be interesting to get some feedback on what the reactions were of your students when they, after the exams, and what they found most challenging. But Mark and Pietro, what were the reactions of your students coming out of the exams? So you were teaching back then, weren't you?
Yeah, it was tough on them, and again, it was that shock of that step up to a linear exam, trying to remember everything, especially for your grade C, D, and E students. Trying to pull the different strands of information together to work out what to do in a question. I think those students found the most challenging. There's something we're going to talk about in a bit about the way some of the AO1 marks were trapped. So there's a requirement in the assessment objectives that when you've got problem solving and communicating AO2 and AO3 questions, that if they have something that could be classed as your standard AO1, which is 50% of the assessment objectives, so use and apply standard techniques, that they will actually have to be classed as an AO1 mark. And that reduced the number of just AO1 standalone questions that students were kind of used to. And I think students found that the most challenging. It was, accessing those AO1 marks within an AO2 and AO3 question, they found very, very challenging. But yeah, it was quite traumatizing for them.
I mean, I would go along exactly with that. Less scaffolding, I think, caused a problem for some of the weaker students, and also some of the modelling, and also the applied paper. Some of the students said to me they ran out of time because there was the statistics and the mechanics, and they were kind of getting bogged down a bit. And then they could do the mechanics question at the end, but they suddenly ran out of time. So it's kind of strategy of how to allot your time, because it's a kind of game you've got to play, and you've got to get that strategy right. In terms of the actual grading, I gave them the June 2018 papers and the mock set 1, and applied the grade boundaries for the June 2018, which obviously came down. And for the June 2019, the grade boundaries were a little bit lower because it was a different cohort in 2018. And actually the students, although the experience perhaps wasn't quite as favorable as they wanted, when it came to result day, there was all smiles again. So they did get, and in fact, most of the exam boards did have similar grade boundaries.
Yes. And this perceived difficulty of the papers was across the board, across all papers. It wasn't just Pearson papers. Steph's just put in the chat that some of her less able students struggle to access the questions, and I think, like you said, Mark, generally weaker at AO3 and the missed opportunities.
It's about making sure that it's a positive experience for them is where we're trying to move this to. Yeah, they will get the grades they deserve, and a lot of them will have that positive smile on on results day, but nobody wants people to go forward in maths and thinking, I got a grade E, but no way did I get a grade E. We want them to be positive about maths as they're going into their future careers, and it's so important.
Yeah. We've been really lucky to talk to Franklin Hayes-Nelly about his experiences of studying maths and doing his A-level exams in June 2019. Franklin was a student back then, and he's been working as an intern at Pearson as well. He couldn't, unfortunately, join us this afternoon, but he's recorded this video that I'm about to play. In a moment, if I can flick to it. It's a great listen. Franklin steps back a bit from the exams and doing the actual papers, and does talk a bit more about what maths means to him as well, and its purpose for him. So we had an interesting chat about this. The recording is just over 10 minutes long, but do keep your comments coming through in the chat while the video is playing, and do use the Q&A to ask us questions.
It's a high pressure situation.
Sorry.
Hi, I'm Franklin. I'm working in the Pearson Product Marketing Comms department, and I'm here to talk to you today about my A-level maths exam. I sat my A-level maths paper in 2019 and subsequently set up a student representative group for that 2019 exam series for students to be able to voice their concerns, basically. During that process, we engaged with something like 1,000 students across multiple platforms and from all over the UK, and subsequently worked with Pearson to open up a dialogue between the students and the exam board for that year. Since coming to Pearson, part of what I've been working on is to help ensure that the qualification assessment process is made more transparent, so that students, parents and carers can have a better understanding of how qualifications are developed and refined over the course of their life cycle. When I look back at my experience of learning maths at school, one of the things I remember most fondly, with the most nostalgia, is the more difficult questions. Finding a tough question, breaking it down into constituent parts, solving the problem, using your knowledge that you already know to solve the problem, marking the question, and then using what you've learned from that entire process to answer a future problem, a similar problem, is a good feeling. There's a genuine sense of progress there. If there was ever a subject made for self-mastery and revision, that would be it. It's the ultimate example of a self-taught subject, a subject that can be completely self-taught and to a really quite high level. There's also the situations that happen every so often that were great, where the teacher would go through and find an extension problem that they didn't quite understand at first glance. So we'd all come together as a class and look at the problem collaboratively. We'd all sit there thinking through the situation, and that collaborative feeling creates a rich and fertile learning environment. It's one of the best ways of teaching, I think. It takes away some of the pressure from the individual student, who remains an active member of the team, an active learner in that sense, but also can bounce off his or her peers, and they can all teach each other things, and there's a rewarding feeling in being able to all come together. You all feel like you're part of the team that answered the difficult question that not even the teacher could answer. To touch very briefly on the application of maths and why the knowledge of maths really is vital in the information age, I'll give you a small personal example. After about 18 months of my A-level qualification, I wrote a few papers on politics and economics running regressions on data. My A-level qualification was absolutely indispensable in that process. Not only did it help me understand the regressions I was running and what the software was doing to the data and what the functions and the numbers meant, but it also helped me understand, it gave me a more technical understanding of the theory and the preliminary literature that was important for me to understand what I was supposed to be looking at. Today, the whole of society is data-driven. It's a statistics age. It's an information age. The demand for a furnished, high-level mathematical understanding has never been higher. We can't make maths easier by the necessity of the demand of the modern world. But we should look to making maths more student-friendly. In In general, I wouldn't say I was underprepared in comparison to my peers. The last few months before the exam is always a chaotic period. There's a lot of content, and you forget really what you struggled with over the last 2 years and what you need to revise to get ready for the exam. Not to mention that, at least in my experience, we rushed through the last few parts of the qualification. Part of me says I drew the short straw with how my teaching turned out, but speaking to other students and looking through forums in 2019 revealed to me that many other students were in the same situation as I was. In that chaos in the last few months of year 13, it's difficult to get proper support. Everyone wants a slice of the teacher, and there's people always running through old parts of the course in their revision, and it's a high pressure situation. Everyone's asking questions about the past, and it really does impede your ability to engage with the maths in front of you, the maths that you're supposed to be, learning to finish off your qualification. In this case, it was some rather difficult integration questions that we'd left for last, and incidentally, and unfortunately for me, they formed the main bulk of the more difficult maths questions for 2019's Paper 1 and 2. Paper 1 was tough. I remember really it hitting me hard, and it sucked the life out of me basically for that exam season. In retrospect and talking to other students, I wasn't really alone in feeling like that. That was why the student rep group in 2019 was so popular and so successful in the first place. Everyone was destabilized after that first paper, and the compact nature of the exam season, you sit maybe, one paper at least every 2 days. It compounded the negative effect that one bad paper at the start of the exam season would have, on confidence, on your ability to deploy what you know, on your general anxiety coming into the exam hall. It was in paper 1 that the problems really started. There was one question, either question 2 or question 3, that was just completely impenetrable to me, and after talking to other students, I found out that they felt the same way about it. Studying for your exams, you're always taught to skip a question and come back to it later if you're finding it difficult, but that advice didn't work well for paper 1 for the following 2 reasons. First, having a difficult question at the start of a paper serves as an instance of doubt. In that moment, you start to doubt yourself and your own ability. In my experience, in my 15 years of education, from primary school to secondary school to college to A-level, it had never occurred once that I would get stuck, completely stuck, stumped, right, on the first 5 questions of a paper. The fact that I did in paper 1 in 2019 gave it a more structural novelty, and I found that difficult to cope with, and speaking to other students, I know that they felt the same way. Second, after that doubt crept in from the first difficult question, you seek a sort of normality in the other paper, in the rest of the paper. You look for that ramping up in difficulty that you're used to, that you've been taught to expect for your whole school career. Paper 1 left you searching for that normality. It left you searching for that ramping up. You never found it, and again, speaking to other students, they felt the same way. The obvious solution to this is just to pay mind to the nature and the structure of the paper, to focus on ramping up. As a rule of thumb, the easy questions go first, the more difficult questions go last, and there's some variation in the middle. My top 3 tips for A-level maths students, well, the first one is just revise, right? Go beyond your spec. There's a really niche part of YouTube for maths that helps you ground your knowledge in challenging situations, on challenging questions. The basic skills you learn for A-level actually go a long way in answering some quite high-level maths questions, some global Olympiad type maths questions. Academic mathematicians have quite a keen sense of humour, right? Sometimes the simplest answer is actually the correct one. It's just a case of building your ability and comfort in deploying mathematical knowledge to be able to spot it. Of course, use things like Dr. Frost Maths, the Pearson workbooks, past papers online. Do 5 to 10 practice questions a day, It isn't much, but it helps you keep on top of your skills, and you can set aside something like 30-minute blocks for them. The most difficult thing is sitting down for that first question. Once you manage that, everything else becomes far, far easier. It might be helpful to do this with a partner. Find a friend, you can motivate each other, you can keep each other on track, you can teach each other stuff, and it just is a way to share the burden of having to revise. The second thing, and probably the most important thing for me, is whiteboards. These things are amazing. Buy one on Amazon, or ask your teacher if they have one, or ask your main office. Just get a whiteboard. You'll go through stacks and stacks of pointless pieces of paper otherwise, and while having old work to look back on is useful for maths is a doing subject, it's not a reading subject, and that's where the whiteboard becomes really quite indispensable. You'll get to do lots of questions, you'll get to save the trees, and frankly there's a sense of completion in wiping down a whiteboard after a difficult problem. Functions strewn all over the place, numbers everywhere, and you get to just wipe it off and leave that problem in the past. There's something satisfying in that. The third thing, and something you need to constantly remind yourself of, is confidence is the name of the game. You have to have serious faith in yourself. Don't be overwhelmed by what you don't know, it will just inhibit you. But if there is some serious question you're struggling with, go to your teacher, ask them about it, note down the relevant spec point or the book chapter, and make sure you cover it on the day that you have the question when you get home. Always trust in your ability. Tell yourself you have this difficult question in the bag, and even if you don't, make sure that you don't let the question beat you. Always come back to it. Always make sure you get it done. You have the internet, you have YouTube, you have your teacher, and you have your wonderful brain at your disposal to come back stronger and defeat the pesky question once and for all. That's how you learn. That's the process of learning. So just don't give up and have real faith and real confidence in your own ability.
A huge thank you to Franklin for taking the time to record that for us and giving us that really honest insight. I think everyone listening will be able to emphasize with that, whether you're a student or a teacher, some great advice there. And yes, some of those questions are a bit pesky, aren't they? But I'm glad you defeated them. After the exams took place, we gathered lots of feedback from students like Franklin and also teachers and parents. As an exam board, we need to be critical about our assessments and make sure they are functioning as they should. We firstly carried out an audit of how we had addressed all that assessment criteria, and we analysed the detailed performance data we had for each question. It revealed what we were expecting, that the transition from a modular to linear course structure has had a significant impact on the students' approach to questions. And students now need to retain so much more information for each assessment. And some of the requirements of the new assessment objectives, as you mentioned earlier, were proving to be demanding for students. However, it also confirmed that the papers that we set overall were actually fair, and they tested across the ability range and the specification. And the performance data showed that the students of all abilities were able to access marks from across the range of questions across the paper. Yet the experience of sitting the actual paper for some students was not what they had expected in terms of perceived level of difficulty. For example, as Franklin mentioned, some early questions in the papers were found to be more challenging than we would typically expect. Although we are unable to change the assessment requirements, following the feedback and the analysis of student performance in the exams, we identified other steps we can take to make our A-level maths papers more accessible and improve the whole assessment experience for the students. We outlined these 4 areas of improvement to focus on: ensuring that early questions were accessible to all, and then making sure they steadily ramped throughout the paper to encourage that initial engagement, instead of just throwing them off, at the first hurdle. Dividing questions into parts so that students are clear where all the marks can be achieved and can attempt the question in parts. Ensuring that we're using clear and concise language to better enable students to access the questions and understand the type of the response they need to give to it. And finally, increasing the number of marks that students find most accessible. These improvements were applied to all A-level papers produced following the June 2019 exams, and that included our mock set 2 papers and the October 2020 papers. Mark is going to talk more about the performance of the October papers. While I hand over, we'd be interested to see and know how much you've engaged with the October papers, because obviously it wasn't a full exam series, it was an optional series for many of you, and we know there was quite a small entry for it. Can you just do, polls hopefully popped up, can you just tell us if you've seen the October papers? And Mark, I will hand over to you now.
Thank you, Preeti. Let's just check that that's all working. Hopefully I should be able to advance the slides. Have you handed over control, Preeti?
Can you request control?
I'll have to request again. There we go.
There you go.
There we go.
So most people actually haven't seen the October papers yet. A few have used them as part of a lesson or as a mock paper. I'm just going to share the results there. The few people who have filled that in. So it's as we expected. We only had about 2,500 entries. But Mark, I'll let you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's well worthwhile. You know, if you've got a spare 10 minutes to spare, just go and have a look at these papers, and hopefully you'll be able to pick out some of the things that I'm going to mention. So I'm going to close that poll for a second, and hopefully this should advance now. Here we go. So in terms of the order of accessibility, what was really important in terms of the student experience is that they shouldn't hit effectively the hardest question first. That's an extreme case. And what we should say is that the October 2020 students were a different cohort compared to a normal cohort. We didn't have the same range or distribution of ability. So when I fire these figures up, I'll need to flag a couple of things up to you. So this is effectively the average mark, the average score on each mark for the 2019 papers. And you can see the order. Question 1 was the best, question 3 next, then 5, then 7, then 6, then 4. Actually, when you zoom forward to the October 2020 papers, you get a different picture entirely. So first of all, what you will see is that there were more questions. And what we're trying to do is allow more opportunities for restarts. So especially on the pure paper, we've increased the numbers on the pure side. So this is the pure 1 paper from 2020. We've not increased the number of questions on the applied side because we're aware that students, there's a lot of context information. On an absolute pure question, it's not much to actually go from one question to another to absorb that information. They're not having to absorb a huge amount. So that allows a higher opportunity for restarts. And you'll actually see that, although question 5 was the best answered, the first 5 questions on the paper were actually the first 5 questions in terms of best answered by students. Don't read too much into the fact that there was, more red areas here. That's due because there was a lot fewer students at the top end, a lot lower ability. So just moving forward about what you might see in the future. So entry patterns, it wasn't the usual cohort at all. I've just got some information here on the kind of the grading patterns. So let's start with 2020. So this is where it's, 2020 summer, we had effectively 24% of students getting a star. Oh, sorry, that was 2019 summer, that was 17% of students. At 2020 summer, we suddenly had 24% of students, and a lot higher in terms of A's and A stars. Now, there was a lot of teachers came in for a lot of criticism for this, and I think it's completely unjust. I was in the classroom last summer. You've got 10 pupils that are graded for, say, you think will achieve an A, but on the day, 2 of them will probably experience a couple of questions that will throw them slightly and end up with a B. What do you do with those students? The only decent thing is actually to award them that central assessed grade of an A. You can't put a piece of paper between these students. It's basically random on the day as to how they performed to a degree. So I think that's where we saw a lot of the grade inflation from next summer. Moving forward on to the October 2020 papers, we're seeing something that's a lot more in line with the 2019 results, but also a lot less students at the top end. There was a lot fewer students actually who, got a grade A and wanted to push it to an A star that resat in the October. And we also got a lot more U's than usual. So in October 2020, there was 7% of students that got a grade U, and in 2019 it was 3%. And that was students, having another go at it and still struggling, maybe because they'd been out of school for a few months and hadn't been able to top up on their revision. So what to expect in the future, as Preeti said, the early questions are very accessible and where most students will have access to most marks. We're trying to aim for early questions between 3 and 6 marks with more restart opportunities. I think if you look carefully at the paper, you'll see that change in emphasis between the years. More restart opportunities within a question. Now that could be between a part A and a part B, where the part B says, part A is, I show that, and part B is, using your answer to part A or otherwise, that show that isn't there to trick the students. It's there to help them, to tell them what to aim for. And your student, you should be recognizing that that's probably what they're going to need in part B. So it's making sure that we've got those restart opportunities. Languages, there's been a lot of emphasis on shorter sentences, layout. The examiners have spent a lot of time working on how to lay the information out so it's more accessible to students. And I always kind of remember there was Sir Dave Brailsford of the Sky cycling team. He says, it's exploiting those marginal gains that they do build up and make a significant difference. So I'll show you an example of change in layout in a little second. And reducing those trapped AO1 marks. So although the AO1 marks, 50% of them are the marks on the paper AO1, what we tended to find was, we actually had trapped AO1 marks in the middle of a question interspersed starting with AO2 or AO3, and because the students couldn't access the first couple of marks, those in theory easy marks, they weren't getting. So we've actually had a big emphasis on making sure that we've got more questions where they start with an AO1 mark so that students can access the start of that mark first of all, and also an increased number of question parts. So I'll show you some facts and figures on that one in a second, but it's quite a significant difference from the last year's series. This is an example of layout. So this is what to expect in the future. So this is 2020 paper 1 question 3. And you can see here that we've actually put things down as key information, as bullet points to draw that student's attention in, just to reduce that cognitive load just ever slightly. Anything we can do, we will do. And here's an example of a legacy question. So literally the same thing, relative to a fixed origin, relative to a fixed origin. The point A has a position vector of this point B and the point B. It's just a better, more accessible layout for students. So moving on, here's an interesting one. So this is 2019. So this is what, although 50% of the marks on the paper are AO1, there was only 13 question parts that were actually entirely AO1, and I think it was something like 107 question parts across all the papers, and they came to a grand total of 27 marks. Let's fast forward to 2020. 21 question subparts were entirely AO1, and also, thinking about those parts could be in the middle of a question, but we're trying to emphasize better restart opportunities to make sure students can actually pick those up again and just give them that better experience and feel like they've come out of it holding their heads high. Looking at those in percentages, so in terms of 2019, it was just 12% of the question parts and 9% of the marks were solely AO1 part questions. And then zooming forward to 2020, it's now up to 20%. So 1 in 5 of the question parts is entirely AO1, and 13% of the marks now are available just as AO1 subparts. And it just, gives better access to those students, a better idea of the ramping to make sure that they start with confidence, because we don't want to knock their confidence and then them give up halfway through the paper. It's really important. So although it is the same distribution of AO1, AO2, AO3, there's been a lot more emphasis, and you're going to see a lot more emphasis in the future on making sure that it is accessible to students and that they have a more positive experience out of it. I'm going to hand over to Pietro now, who's going to go into kind of a little bit of that in a bit more detail. Pietro, are you okay with control?
I'm just requesting it, so hopefully everything will be up and running. Preeti just has to allow. Yes, I'm going to be quite quick here because there's only not that much time left, so I might skip a few of these, but you will get a copy of the PowerPoint with the notes and whatever. So these are just really amplifying and illustrating some of Mark's points. So this is question 1 and question 2 from the June 2019 and the October 2020, and you can compare the level of demand. I would say the October 2020, again, 3-mark question, it's more familiar. Obviously, I've got the kind of examiner's report quotes and things on it, just to get it to, there we are. So 69% success rate. And remember, this was a weak cohort that took that particular paper, as Mark said. So that's that's what we want. And it probably would have been much higher than that if we'd have had the full cohort taking that particular paper. This is just just to illustrate what the assessment objectives are there. You can see 2 AO1s and an AO2 in there, but it looks a familiar kind of solution, much more textbook as far as the students are concerned. So hopefully, that's then this is an examiner report quote. I picked up on that one. There's many fully correct answers. This one here, this was an unusual one because this one was answered reasonably well, but it's kind of working backwards with the logs. So there obviously, there is a new specification. There are new assessment objectives. So that one there is something I picked up as being a little bit different. And then if you look at the mark scheme, that's the kind of vital step that I've highlighted there, which is working backwards from the laws of logs. So again, when you're teaching that, I think that's something you need to bring into your teaching. I was lucky that when I was teaching that, I actually did do that as part of my teaching, but I suspect that maybe some students weren't ready for that little twist. This one here is a stats question, and look how many 1 mark parts there are. 1 mark, 1 mark, 1 mark, and then 2 marks. So you can just keep going. It's almost GCSE style when you look at it. However, when I looked at the exam statistics, a lot of students fluff the first part. It's quite interesting when you look at the examiner report quote, and the success rate was actually quite low on, I think it comes up in the statistics there, look at 3A, only 32%. And I think if you gave that to your GCSE class, they might have a higher than 32% success rate on that question. So there's always surprises. There's always surprises.
Again, that might be a reflection of the fact that it was an interesting cohort and not a usual cohort.
Exactly. But I mean, that's a dead, I mean, that whenever have we seen a mark scheme as simple as that to mark? There's not much debate there, really. This one here again is the testing of the large data set. And they were pleased with the response, and that came up in the examiner report quote that the students are getting familiar with the large data set. There's always an element of kind of luck in a sense with some of those. That may be something that they happen to look at in a lot more detail. There's an element of luck because some of those parts aren't really that mathematical. The more you practice, the luckier you get, I suppose, is the phrase for that one, really, with the large data set. But there it is. So I just click in the wrong place there. And good success rate there on part 2A, and 2B maybe not so much, 96%. And there was more than one option. Just a tip as well for your students, particularly with mechanics, if they have to make suggestions for different modeling things, if there's a couple of marks, they're looking for 1 or 2 facts. If they name more than 2 of them, and some of them are wrong, they will lose marks. So if they name more than what they're asked to, they've got to all be right to get the mark, because sometimes the kitchen sink and too many of those different suggestions in, particularly for mechanics modeling, inextensible string, blah, blah, blah. They put too many in, and if some of them are wrong, they can end up losing marks, even though the correct one's in there. This is I've gone back to June 2018. So this is a binomial question on June 2018. Okay, it's number 6 in the paper, but there's lots happening. It's pretty complicated from the beginning. Those weaker students would really struggle, I think, with that one, and the success rate was quite low on that one. But if we now look at the October 2020, yes, it's question 1, but it's a nice gentle, it starts with 1. Success rate on that one, as hoped for. So in a sense, the examiner is saying as hoped for, which means they were planning for it to be a gentle start. And the majority of candidates got all the available marks for that particular question. Well, 76% success rate. And for a weak cohort, I think that's, again, that would be much higher if we had a full cohort. And if you look at the mark scheme, it's looking very C4-ish, if I that's a correct phrase to use.
That's exactly the phrase I'd use.
This one here, again, going rather quick here. This one here is unusual. I can't remember the last time I saw a 2-mark question on an A-level paper at number 8. So that was quite unusual. Again, I've just put in what the examiner report quotes were for some of them. Success rate wasn't that good, though. So, you know, there's always going to be pluses and minuses. That's maybe why it was placed at number 8 rather than numbers 1 to 5. But so again, modeling is one of those things which is kind of new, and it's comprehension and changing the words into mathematics, which I think is still something that students need more practice on. There's the mark scheme for it. Again, it's AO3 and then AO1. You see the assessment objectives there. This was a question on a projectile question. Again, it's a bit small for some of your screens. Again, I've put the examiner report quotes in. This obviously used to be in the legacy M2, which a lot of schools didn't cover as part of their A-level. It became a kind of further maths module. But it's reasonable, you know, 5A, 46%. The projectile question success rate was a lot lower, I can tell you, when we look at the June 2018 and 2019 papers. So although it's quite low success rate, it was a weak cohort, and nearly half of them getting 5A and getting some marks is a positive start. It was also handy they put the diagram in there to help them, whereas some of the questions don't have diagrams on some of the 2018 papers and 19 papers. So the modeling's there for them. Now, this one, a lot of you will have nightmares about. Some of my students, when they came out, said, was it kinematics? And they didn't realize it was even the trapezium rule because of the context. It's only the estimate that 1 or 2 of them realized what it was really getting at. This is question 2 back in, and then here's the October version of it. And again, it's very C4-ish. It says use the trapezium rule. So it's actually telling them to use the trapezium rule. And there isn't even a missing value in the table. So again, what was the success rate of this one? Again, answered well. The majority of candidates were able to do it. I don't know if I got the marks. There we are. That's the 66% success rate, much higher than it was for that previous one that you saw. Keep going. And that's the, again, very simple mark scheme. Again, it's very familiar. It's number 6, but hence using algebraic integration. In other words, you can use your calculator to check it, but don't use your calculator to do it, to get your method marks. But again, it's one of these hence ones where they've obviously got to find the values of A, B, and C, but it's a follow-on. It's much more familiar. Again, we would have seen a question like that on legacy papers. And it resulted in a very good success rate for part A and 55% for B. And again, we've seen mark schemes like that going back years for that particular question. This one here, proof and consecutive questions, which is quite interesting. I've got me flying through, I've remembered everything, I've got my notes with statistics on them, but this one here, these were still fairly poorly answered, particularly number 16, and I think that is an area that I really did focus on when I was teaching it, but I found that the weaker students still found it difficult to do some of the proofs. Certainly for many, many years, number 15, I always taught that. I always taught those proofs of the sum of the AP and the sum of the GPs, just in case it came up, and it did that particular year, you see here. And again, we've got some statistics which are coming up. Only 23% success rate on that, and it is textbook, it's in the textbook. The second one, the number 16, this multiples and factors and multiples of 3, they do come up most years now in that way, odd and even. There's a 23%. This one here, very poorly answered still, so you know, we've got to hold our hands up high and say it is a new spec, it is October 2020, but that one is certainly something, yeah. Again, 6%, but again, a weak cohort as well, as Mark said, and it is quite a way into the paper. So a little proof interlude. That's the one. I've just taken that from the textbook, just a screenshot from the Pearson textbook. So it is fairly textbook way. I've just do a bit of maths first and the last. Whenever I taught this, I always said SR rather than RS, because I'm old enough, just as a way of them remembering it, I'm old enough to remember the toothpaste, you see. There it is.
I won't say how old I was when you started teaching, Pietro.
No question, no answer. There it is. This one is the one for those multiples, and it's making that start, the 3K, 3K plus 1 and 3K plus 2, the kind of sets, that's what they've got to, if they can make that start, they're often okay to get through that question and pick up some marks. Again, there's a big step on one of these, which is writing that 4 to force it to factorize with the 3. So there are certain tricks they also have to know to be able to get that. So that's where that 1 came from in the bracket. And there also a lot of students, certainly when I was teaching it and marking mocks, they didn't do the last step, which is virtually the question to get that conclusion mark. They kind of stop, assuming the examiner knows they've done it. And it's just encouraging our students to do that final step.
I think it's, you know, what we really need to do is make sure that we're encouraging teachers as much as possible to practice proof with their students as much as possible. Because I think, you know, I think that's potentially been underestimated a little bit.
And then this one here, again, I'm just going to do this as a little activity just to keep you guys awake in the chat. Can you put in the chat some of the key words in terms, this is June 2018. So again, it's very wordy, remember the language, but can you see how many assumptions there are for modeling? I'll give you a kickoff. Look at that first sentence. It's at rest on a smooth horizontal table. And then it passes over a pulley that's fixed. And there's loads, and if you want to put a few of those words in, there's lots of modeling words in that question, and it's, you've got to read the thing and get through the thing before you even think of answering it. And that's just an example from an earlier mechanics question in terms of all the different wording and things there. I think the success rate was 62% got started, but only 31% were able to get that question totally through. And this is an AS one. So let's just see any more. Yeah, I can see them coming through now. Yeah, it does not rebound. Yeah. Thanks for that. And then I'm going to stop at this one here. I think it's probably a good time to finish. There are some others, but I've covered most of what I wanted to cover. So in the chat window, can you just have a guess what percentage of students got full marks on that question? Again, it's quite a short question. What percentage of students got full marks on that question? Just to... So you got 20%, 55, 9.
Higher, lower, higher. Lower. It's like play your cards right.
Yeah,
brilliant.
There won't be a prize for getting the right one. Has anyone actually got it? We'll give you a free set of October 2020 papers or something as a prize. Let's have a look here, because most of you haven't seen them. Right, so what was it? It was, oh, I've missed it. I've gone back. It was 42% success rate, 42% success rate. It should have dissolved, but sometimes those transitions don't work on those boxes. And then this one here, June 2019, 60%, getting better. But I'll stop there. I think because I've gone over my time, there are a few more questions, but I've covered most of the essentials. And I think you can see the difference between the 2020 exams and the earlier ones. And I think with a full cohort, I think we can be quite confident, and maybe you'll find that out when you use your mock next time. And there's another set of mocks on the way as well, I think, Preeti, that you might want to talk about. Okay, I'll hand back to Preeti. Thanks a lot for that. There we are. Just a few more there, just flying through. There we are.
Yeah, as Pietro said, if you do, when you do use those papers, you'll hopefully start seeing those changes, and they're going to be reflected in all future papers as well. This is some of the feedback we have had from the few people who have done the paper, but we would like to know what you think of them as and when you see them. So I've just put a link to a questionnaire we've just released today. in the chat to let us know your thoughts on the paper once you've accessed it. So do look at the form and fill it in for us if you've done the papers, and do share that with colleagues as well. So the journey does not stop here for A-level maths. We are continuing to look for ways to improve A-level maths assessments as the qualification evolves. And in order to do this, we will continue to listen to feedback from teachers and students, and we'll carefully monitor question paper performance data as well, hopefully when we next have a full exam series. Thank you for joining us for this session as part of the Pearson Maths Festival. We do hope you found it interesting. Sorry for going over time a little bit, but hopefully there was some helpful starting points for further discussion in there. We have 2 more sessions this week to end the festival. There's one tomorrow at 4 o'clock, which is 360 maths support, which is a session exploring maths resources that Pearson offer. And on Friday, we're talking to Bobby Seagull about maths in the media. So do tune into those if you can. You will see a feedback survey open in your browser when we end the webinar. If you could just take a couple of minutes to complete this, that would be really appreciated. And finally, we just want to remind you again to join the conversation on social media and beyond using the hashtag PearsonMathsFest21, and by entering our mini competitions, nominating your colleagues as maths champions, and by answering our polls that you'll see in the Pearson Schools Twitter pages. Please do get involved. And I think Joey's just popped some a link to our website where you can get some further information as well. So thank you again from all of us, and have a great rest of the evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.